and guarantee the sustainability of the sector for a long term. But before we start, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Sharka Prat for welcoming address. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to welcome you on behalf of the European Libera Forum to this online discussion named Cure for Crisis, How to Get Cultural and Creative Sectors Back to Their Feet. My name is Sharka Prat, and I am an elected board member of the European Libera Forum and executive director of the Institute for Politics and Society. The European Libera Forum is gathering liberally oriented institutions, think tanks, and foundations. Together, all these think tanks are creating a platform for dialogue on liberal policies, values, ideas, integration, and above all else, the impact of the COVID pandemic on cultural and creative sectors. How these sectors are challenged and what opportunities they seek. Discussions on such topics should be encouraged in the face of current conditions. The year 2020 and now also 2021 are marked by the global pandemic of COVID-19. No country in Europe was left untouched by the ensuing economic, social, and political troubles. The various legislative actions taken by national governments to subvert the pandemic were controversial, but ultimately widely accepted. However, now we are seeking the impact of these actions on human rights, economic systems, and creative sectors. Today, we would like to focus mainly on the situation in Europe and debate the challenges and opportunities for culture and creative sectors. When the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic hit, these sectors faced huge logistical challenges as all activities have to be moved to the online world. What are the policies and support mechanisms intended to help the creative sectors survive and recover? How actually do these policies and mechanisms work? These are questions that must be asked and answered in the new era of COVID. Some newly developed communication and technological tools appear to be very effective on the labor market and can be used even after the pandemic subsidies. However, there are still areas where these tools cannot be leveraged, sometimes as a result of legal barriers. Additionally, the pandemic has emphasized the need for international cooperation in the face of a global crisis. This may give us a new momentum for deeper cooperation on the European level moving forward. On behalf of the European Libera Forum, I wish you a pleasant discussion, and I firmly believe that this event will prove fruitful, informative, and productive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Today's forum is organized and supported by European Libera Forum and Institute Novum in Ljubljana in collaboration with the Culture Policy Designers Network. And our panelists today are all members of the network. We really aim to cover Europe from the northern tip, from Finland, all the way down to Malta. We are looking at small countries. I'm from Estonia, and Tony is from Malta, but also to some of the biggest countries in Europe. Tom from the UK, but also then covering both the European Union members and the former members of the European Union. So we have an interesting mix of panelists. Our panelists are really very well known in the fields of culture creative industries in Europe. So I'm delighted to be a part of this distinguished panel today. We are joined from Finland by Silja Suntola. Silja was instrumental in setting up Creative Finland, one of the first and one of the most successful creative industries development bodies or agencies in Europe, one of the first ones, to be honest, as well. And Silja has a very long experience working by connecting culture creative industries with higher education. She's worked in Aalto University, and for the past years, she's been development manager at the creative industries unit at the Southern Eastern Finland University of Applied Sciences. Then we have Tom Fleming from Tom Fleming Consultancy. Tom is from UK, but really has worked across the world, not just Europe. He's been instrumental in building creative industries policy strategies, working with many cities, regions around the world, in cultural capitals, European cultural capitals, projects in public and private sectors. So vast expertise and vast range of experience to bring into our discussion today. And then we have Tony Attard from Malta, a former strategy director, author of the culture policy in Malta, but really more known across the world as a fighter for the cultural rights, and an artist himself, a theater director, an actor, and not only him, Silja also here is a music background. So it's good to see those organizational policy making expert level, but also artistic backgrounds coming here together. My name is Ragnar Siil from Estonia. I'm also from the Culture Policy Designers Network, and have been involved for many years in culture and creative industries, policy design across the world. Anyway, let's start. And this is the second panel discussion in the series. And the first one really looked at the impact assessment of the current ongoing crisis on culture creative sectors. So this is something we try to avoid today. We are not supposed to talk about too much in detail about if culture creative sectors are impacted and how they are impacted, but rather, do we see end in sight, and how do we get out of that crisis? How can the public sector support culture creative industries in this fight for survival? But not only that, not only public sector, but how can also creative sectors themselves innovate and strengthen their resilience from within to come out of the crisis in a sustainable manner? These are the questions we are going to talk about. But before we really start, we in the Culture Policy Designers Network had a series of talks approximately 10 months ago. So in April, in May, in 2020. And I had those talks with all three of you back then individually. And all of our talks ended with one simple question. Where do you think we find ourselves exactly in 1 year if we would have that talk again? I don't think that you all expected we to talk again in 1 year, but here we are. So you probably do not remember what you thought the world would look like, but I do. So let me go one by one and let me see if some of those predictions and also expectations came true. Silja, you were not very optimistic. You thought that the world will be better than a year ago, but you also had a message, and you hoped that wherever or whatever the situation is, you hope that because of the crisis or due to the crisis, people and societies have really understood the value of culture more than probably before. Do you think that this hope or expectation has come true now, a year later?
Thank you, Ragnar. It's interesting that I said that, but I actually do agree with that I can see a tiny idea that we are getting sort of beyond the conversation of pure economic value of culture. Perhaps it's not quite there, but we sort of value well-being, safety, health, all those sorts of issues, and also just the cultural values we share and the role of culture in shaping these, talking about inclusion, equality, a lot of things that are globally on the table today. So I want to at least still believe that. So I do.
Mm-hmm. Tony, you were the most optimistic out of the bunch here, and well, that's not surprising. You are very optimistic in general. You said that in 1 year we are probably sitting in the same room, so Trimon. But you said that while we are sitting in the same rooms, you hoped that the conversations we have in a year's time in the same room would be more meaningful than before. So where do you find yourself with such a wrong prediction?
I don't know about you, but I am still sitting in the same room, but on my own. So probably only half of that is true. I think that thought still holds in terms of we know now more than ever what it means to be sharing space and thoughts with someone in a physical space, that live experience. We also know what it means to have a digital experience. And we know that probably one is not versus the other, but they're very different. But when I am physically in the same room, probably even in a digital space, but more in a physical space with someone, I want to make the most of that and also give it more value. So just to give you an example, I'm working on a new theater production right now. The first part of the process was doing online readings. Our online readings were Zoom in, read, move on to the next meeting. Last week, we physically met in the same room for rehearsal. And it was the first time in all our distance, and all actors were opposite each other. But that was the moment when I said, this is why I do theater. It didn't happen when I was doing it on Zoom for a lot of reasons, but I wanted that, the meaning of that and what I could creatively make out of that was definitely, on this occasion, I would say much more than what I did digitally. But probably this pattern will even extend, and it's interesting because all these conversations have emerged even in festivals, saying even our mobility needs to be longer but more meaningful. Even, flying in to produce something and flying out, that is probably going to change because we know what we want to achieve out of that longer, more meaningful engagement. Of course, we're going to still have probably more festivals hopping in and out, but I think people are starting to think differently about that. Unfortunately, it took a global pandemic for us to start reflecting on this.
Mm-hmm. Very good, and we will come back to this very, very soon. Tom, now out of everyone, you were probably the most correct with your prediction. You were most sober, most, well, I wouldn't say pessimistic, you're probably most realistic. You said that we probably are still in a lockdown, but not a continuous lockdown, but we probably will see those waves coming and going, and we need to somehow get used to them and module our life around that. But in addition to that, you sent a year ago a very clear message on the need, both on a local, national, but also on the European level, need for reframing culture, reframing the way we understand culture. And you hope that even if we are still in a lockdown in a year's time, that that kind of a reframing has taken place, or at least has started. Do you think that this has happened?
I'm pleased, first of all, Ragnar, that there was some level of accuracy in my prophecy. I'm very surprised by that, given that there's so much that we're still learning about ourselves and learning about this new disease and everything else that goes with it. I'm going to be optimistic, first of all, because perhaps I'm not sufficiently optimistic enough of the time. And I think we all need to be optimistic to get through the seeming perpetuity of sitting in the same room, considering these matters. I'm going to be optimistic in that I do think that there is a reframing taking place. And Silja mentioned that as well. And that I think I did talk about the need back then to rethink the value proposition for culture. And I do think that has involved a reframing of the narrative. And I do feel that there is a new language emerging. And I do feel that the sector is getting more confident in articulating that new language. And it does relate to the intrinsic value of culture more so. It does relate to talking about our well-being, our health, our cohesion. And it also talks about environmental sustainability and responsibility. And even things like links to nature and thinking through what we value as a society, or what we should be valuing as we've paused and now we hopefully are resetting. But I'm going to caveat all that optimism in that we're still sitting here and we don't really know what reality looks like yet, because we're living in a phony context where the digital has accelerated because it's the only show in town. But hopefully, as the disease becomes more managed, we're going to move into a more hybrid reality where the physical starts to coexist with the digital. So in other words, we're going to start going out again. We're going to start hopefully going to shows, festivals. We're going to be meeting with our friends, having meals together, all these kinds of things. So the digital is going to have a different relationship with the physical. And in that context, there's going to be all sorts of complex policy decisions that will be needed to make about how to support the sector through that transitional phase. And that's when we'll really see the extent to which the value proposition has been reframed. Will there be new funding streams that support the intrinsic value of culture? Will there be new support to build the sector's capacity to deliver health and well-being outcomes? Will we look at artistic mobility in a different way? Will we incentivize slower, more sustainable approaches towards international collaboration? And we don't know yet, because we haven't moved from the same situation we were in 10 months ago. I am literally welded to this seat. So let's see. But let's be optimistic that the language will turn into a reality which is different to where we were 12 months ago.
Mm-hmm. But just a follow-up point there. While even last time we discussed that what makes this crisis different, often to maybe different types of crisis, is that it is really overwhelming and global. You know, you talk to people from Taiwan to US, from Finland to South Africa, and everybody's impacted on this. But on the other hand, now if you take Europe, you also see that the level of let's say lockdowns have been very different in different countries. There are places where, as you mentioned, people have not been able to go to concerts, theaters for months and for a very long time. And then there are countries, Estonia included, where we've since last May, all theaters, museums, concerts been open. We've seen the festivals, we've seen the events happening. So do you see that might cause a little bit of problem, that you see some parts of Europe which have been much more involved in cultural activities than others, or you don't see that as an issue?
Well, I certainly think obviously if that affects different things, it affects the audience behaviour, and because in some countries where there's been much harsher lockdowns and where the sector's essentially been closed down, then we don't know how the audiences will behave when it reopens. Levels of nervousness, the extent to which habits have been broken. We don't know the extent to which the sector can recover enough capacity to fulfill demand, however that changes. So that's one thing that we need to explore. I think that there's probably a lot of opportunity to learn from countries that had a softer lockdown and created a kind of third way between more stringent measures and totally open cultural system. So I would have thought that we could look, for example, at Estonia and actually see how audiences behave, see how organisations were able to remodel their approach to just sustainability and financial management, where there perhaps were smaller audiences than you would have in normal times, and how do you develop those kinds of solutions? And perhaps also there's something to learn about the way that the audiences behaved and what they started to value in the context of the pandemic. We don't know, because we're living somewhat in the dark in the UK and other countries where the lockdowns have been so harsh.
Let's go to you, Tony, now, and maybe follow up just what Tom said. we had to conclude, and already in summer, and this has really been going on, that there has not been as many research on impact analysis in the field of culture and creativity than in the past year. And you yourself were kind of very much involved in one of those research in Malta, and we probably all have been involved in one way or another. But now, what Tom was mentioning, that was bringing another layer. So you just don't look at how the crisis has impacted the sector or subsector as such, economically, or how the operational models have changed, but also looking at how the crisis have changed the way people what they expect from culture, what do they miss from, missing out of culture, how do the consumption models have changed, etc. Do you agree with this? Do you think that the culture sector is ready, or do they understand the changing nature of the market?
I think the cultural sector had no choice to figure out whether it has to change or not, because the market made a change, and also the situation made a change. If I may go a little bit to add on to what Tom was saying in terms of audience behavior. I mean, we do have some research now emerging in terms of what would give peace of mind for the audience to return. And we keep on seeing this probably in a lot of studies, the availability of the vaccine. And that actually starts linking to what was said before in terms of inclusion and the quality, and because this is really an unfair situation, because not everyone has yet access to this vaccine. So again, this whole idea of who has access to the vaccine, and how will the global population. So probably we may say, well, the population in country X has received the vaccine, but that is not what the global story is all about. So if we really talk about culture and access and really cultural rights here, we are even starting from a deficit in a way on how we are even going to emerge from this. So that is not just from an audience point of view, but also from that global perspective. I think the whole situation a year later is really showing us that this is kind of a symptom of how everything else, how the whole value chain works. So probably if you operate in an environment which is highly dependent or exclusive on, for example, public funding, then the end result is going to be very different to an ecology that has this kind of diverse funding or business model. And also on whether, for example, from a policy making, it was agile enough to develop the necessary changes, as opposed to those countries who require actual legislation to implement new methods. Just think about it, like even from an EU perspective, the European Recovery Program will be approved by April this year. It's like a year later. For most in the industry, that's way too late to even think of recovery. If you've shut down, you've shut down. If you're barely surviving, probably this is going to be too late. On the other hand, it was a great test for those who thought and designed and changed in a very quick way. So, those who embraced the situation and said, this is my research and development time, as opposed to putting things in a live format, probably the success rate there is very, very different. And we're going to keep on seeing this. What my main concern from the research I conducted here, the first part of research, was actually to figure out the precarious, the gig economy, which the whole cultural sector has been based on. And frankly speaking, I don't think that is going to change much, because it is what we do. We shift from one project to another. But probably how we design our work, how we develop our work, how we collaborate with other industries becomes even more important than ever. And probably not because we need it to survive, but I would say it is going to be the only way for us to grow, on how we cross over with others. I think our sector has spent too much time thinking about itself, too much time focusing in its own little bubble. I know bubble is a very popular word right now, but we really need to burst this. And I would say the reason why most of us across Europe are still with a begging bowl, telling people, give us the 2% of your budget, think of culture, is actually showing how probably on an even European level, I can be a bit critical here, that even our advocacy is a bit weak. And I see this even on a national level. Thanks to the pandemic, I was involved in together with a number of colleagues of mine to set up the first entertainment and arts association in the country. It took quite a global crisis to actually bring sectors together. Why? Because the hotel industry was first around the table to talk about subsidy and support. The construction industry, the manufacturing industry, and the arts and the creative sectors were not there around that negotiating table. So this is, I think this still is a huge learning curve for all of us.
But just follow up quickly. So from Maltese experience, we have discussed quite a lot the difficulties to get the support, but then some government support came in.
Yeah.
Do you have any good examples on measures from the public sector that really have been very beneficial, that really support a sector in this crisis? And also, do you see the difference between measures, especially public measures, that just take care of the immediate impacts of crisis versus kind of an investment into getting out of the crisis, being ready for the new situation post-COVID, taking advantages of opening societies? Do you see that difference between just barely surviving versus actually thriving?
Definitely, and I think this was, if you had to scan the number of measures that were let me use Malta as an example. So the first thing was really about survival, making sure that people whose job has come to an end, we had most people, especially in the live arts, for example, who had absolutely no work coming up. I think the lifesaver there was the implementation of a wage supplement. So that was a general government measure of €800 per month for anyone who actually even self-employed, which also included the cultural and creative sectors. And I think this was the most important thing, to make sure that the cultural and creative industries are embedded across all measures, rather than having sectoral measures. I must say those took a longer time for them to emerge and to develop, and it took a couple of months until the national budget. So the first recovery programs were actually launched only a couple of weeks ago in terms of new funding programs. And again, the kind of responses there tended to be slower than the overall government measures. I think it is only now where we're starting to see measures that look at recovery and post-recovery and growth. I think people were still dealing with the day-to-day shock system. And then probably the moment where people said, okay, I can pay my bills, I can survive, I can now start thinking of new ways on how to operate. Having said that, I'm not sure whether public policy itself inspired or led to this process. Probably it was a need of those who said, I'd better figure out what I'm going to do with my business and how I can take that further. What we start seeing now are a number of initiatives that start looking again about this cross-sector. So even from our end, we were even lobbying and calling for measures that really talk about industries coming together on how the tourism industry, for example, can reinvent itself, can reboot with the culture and creative industries. Because ultimately, what's the use of thinking of just the culture and creative sectors on their own as if they, it's true, we survive with audiences, with a market, but a market comes from other ways. If people don't have the disposable income to spend on culture, then that's going to impact all of us. So we need a healthy economy. Everyone needs a healthier economy for the culture and creative industries to grow. The biggest challenge I think we have at this point is to bring back people into the sector who have already left the sector. People who shifted to other industries because there was no other option. And that is probably going to take time. It took us 20 years to build an industry, and it took one pandemic to actually dismantle most of it.
Let's jump up to the north, Finland. Finland has been praised alongside likes of New Zealand, for example, or Iceland, with being very quick in its response, being very effective. Your corona numbers have been on a lower end throughout the crisis. So on one hand, it seems that the crisis is better managed than in many other places. So maybe in few words, how much of this crisis has actually impacted culture creative sectors in Finland, in the Nordic countries, but also, do you see that the government response coming in and supporting the sectors and its need in this particular, with these particular challenges, have been adequate?
Okay, thank you. If I start about the situation here, we have been so far pretty lucky, and it looks like the measures have been quite successful, except for the last few weeks. We're quite on a high rise again, so it goes up and comes down. So let's just hope for the best and so forth. Definitely the crisis has hit everybody, and definitely the creative sector, just in Finland, just like in any other sector, with especially, of course, performing arts and events management, festivals and things like that. And I think it's really difficult, even if we'd had some numbers, it's really difficult to assess the situation yet, because also, like Tony sort of said, it's about some small, because most of the companies in the creative industries are small, and they are really harshly hit and can on individual level be extremely hardly hit, which means like good people and good enterprises and individuals just are shifting to something else, which is really, really a pity. Of course, there have been similar problems, like I'm sure everywhere, as how has the government been able to support creative industries. And I'm sure if you'd ask creative industries or businesses in general, they would be no. But also I would go as to say that I think we're much discussing about the similar challenges that we have all along with funding creative industries. They're difficult to fund because a lot of the funding agencies or the policy people is still a struggle to really get them to understand the impact or the meaning or the value of culture and creative sector. And they're struggling from the thing that it's really difficult. They're small companies and not always companies. It's typical for the sector that people and individuals get their income from multiple sources. You might do freelancing, you teach a little, you might have a business on the side and so forth, which I have to say at this point is also might be a good thing, especially in a crisis situation, that you're not just sitting on one chair. But at the same time, that situation leaves you quite in a difficult spot as far as funding comes. Funding is very often to just companies and development and research, or just the public sector, or for individual artists. And to live in between these sectors has certainly its challenges. So I think the best option, or at least one good option, is really to keep up and keep opening the real value of the creative industries and keep developing and bending the instruments we have, because it is slow enough, like Tony said, to change those. It takes time. Even the so-called more quicker ones, they still are hard to change. And even if they try to quickly now, fit for the Corona challenge that we're dealing with, they still have a lot of small things that it has this rule and this money has to be done like this because of a ton of reasons. So there are a few funding mechanisms that are quicker, more flexible. But as we've said years, the creative industries do need more flexible, maybe even smaller fundings because they're small companies. So in comparison, but quick, flexible, and as we know, artistic outcomes are really difficult to predict. And even investing in something that actually might not be a success, it can actually in the long run still lead to something that in turn will lead to some success. So it's very difficult in reality to evaluate the success or not success of investment in something creative. And that dilemma goes way beyond the Corona. But I hope that the Corona crisis will help the awareness of the nature of the creative industry so that funding instruments will be developed at the same time so that they better suit the creative industries. And I have to say, not just the creative industries, but any sector, because I'll take on to another thing Tony said about gig economy and project doing. I think it's a very good point. Like I said, that a lot of artists actually work many jobs or many kinds of things and multiple sources, and between entrepreneurism and between freelancing and so forth. And that again is sort of falling in between the cracks, so to speak, that you're not exactly an entrepreneur, you're not a student, you're not unemployed, you're not employed. So and we know that that's a challenge. So that's another big thing that, especially in these sorts of needs, should be. So, but we've known that before the Corona. But at the same time, as I've always said, that I think one of the best values of creative industries is that they have something, because they're sort of forerunners, they set trends that other people or other sectors can learn from. There's a lot of interest about how a creative process works, and other fields want to learn from it. So it's the same when we think of leadership or the type of work for the future. We know that creative work is important in the future, so why not look at the creative sectors? So in that regards, if we develop a mechanism to support creative industries in the creative industries, I believe we do that in any sector, which again leads me to that, yes, I also believe that one solution is to really open the discussion and make sure that creative industries is not left in a silo, not funding wise and not otherwise either in definition wise, but to know that it's a horizontal thing. And I think in Finland we have had a very good general conversation and consensus that yes, it's a horizontal thing, but it doesn't make it any faster to actually get to the grad roots. It makes it more challenging because there's that whole spectrum of different layers and different silos that our societies are still in to be, made to understand the situation.
Listening to you, Silja, is quite frustrating and quite discouraging, because if a person from Finland, a country that is generally known as one of the most innovative, one of the most flexible, one of the most, low bureaucracy, let's do attitude, startup mindset countries of Nokia and Angry Birds. If a Finn talks about measures being slow, silos being in place, things not being horizontal enough, then what's the chance for the others?
This was the policy thing, And I do think that the creative people still, they have their way of working around the fringes, which means that they're not in the silos. Maybe some of them are, just like any other people, but yes.
We will come back to you in a short while, but Tom, I mean, not just like this crisis would not be enough. Even without this crisis, we would have another panel discussion and talk about another crisis of Brexit and impacts of Brexit and the UK partners being kind of a disconnected from the European funding mechanisms and networks, etc. And now all of this together. So, do you see those two big influences, both the aftermath of Brexit, but also now with a crisis? Do you see them somehow overlapping, making things worse, or actually easing each other up? How do you see the situation in culture creative industries in UK in this context?
All right, and can't we just talk about Finland? I said earlier on that that we're in this strange situation where we don't really know what will happen next because we've been locked down. So we don't know how the cultural sector will respond. We don't know yet how the policymakers will respond. And I think the same can be said with regard to Brexit. And Brexit is, I think, much more profoundly damaging to the UK cultural system than COVID is or will be, because it's so long term and it's so entrenched, and it will shift the very terms of reference for cultural policy and cultural collaboration in where our key market is, which is in the European Union. So that's a hugely challenging thing to get our heads around, let alone to work out how to positively respond to it. But we don't know yet how it will impact on many things because we're all still at home. So it's all about the, in theory, challenges. But there's, as you've probably noticed, there's obviously been huge uproar in response to the so-called trade deal that the UK and European Commission signed up to, because we know even from sitting at our home that in our homes it's going to be hugely detrimental to the mobility of artists. It's going to create a huge amount of bureaucracy and red tape and expense in terms of being able to tour work. It's creating all sorts of friction. So even the most optimistic people, who say that you need friction to innovate, would suggest that this is a bit too frictiony to really open up opportunities for the cultural sector in the UK. Well, I find it hugely depressing every day trying to conceptualize how Brexit is going to impact on not just the UK cultural system, but also obviously on the collaborations and friendships and relationships that have been fostered over many years with our friends across the European Union, which is why obviously I set up our company to be in the European Union as well as a response to this, partly technical, but also emotional, to be based in the European Union as well. So I think that there's a massive storm coming, and it's coming at absolutely the worst time possible for the cultural sector, because as we all are feeling, we're stuck in the middle of this pandemic, and it couldn't be hitting a sector that's more vulnerable, and it's horribly bad timing, and it doesn't make any strategic sense whatsoever in terms of developing effective cultural policy. I want to go back to Finland though, because I think this is another way of talking about where we may resolve some of these issues in terms of policy over the long term. So up in the north of Finland, in the city of Oulu, their European Capital of Culture bid is all about what they call cultural climate change. And obviously that links to the role of arts and culture in response to environmental change. But actually what they're calling for is a shift in terms of who participates in the cultural sector and the creative industries, and who therefore can develop and shape and reshape the sector in the future. And this relates to the challenges of COVID, and in the UK context, the challenges of Brexit, in that we're all stuck in the now or the near future in trying to think through how do we support those organisations that are struggling so much at the moment, how as Tony pointed out, how do we get people who've left the sector to come back to the sector? But I think the biggest crisis, the biggest challenge is around people who aren't yet in that sector. So it's about the future generations. It's young people, but it's also diverse communities. It's communities of difference. It's the wider talent base. And as Sylvia mentioned, that the COVID crisis has brutally exposed the structural inequalities in our society, and those inequalities obviously are so clear in the cultural and creative industry sector. We all knew they were there anyway. It's obviously it's hugely damaging to the freelance economy, etc. But it's more so damaging to people who haven't got any kind of financial backing or who haven't got social capital already. So therefore, it's going to be massively more damaging to people from different backgrounds, from diverse communities, from people who are fragile in their economic circumstance anyway. So we need to think about how we reframe opportunities for talent to participate in the sector longer term. And we need therefore to go right back to the basics in terms of the education system. So Finland, again, a pioneer in terms of creative education, arts education, at the very fundamentals of the system. This crisis has exposed where schools have been closed, the huge educational inequalities that exist. And those educational inequalities obviously bleed into inequalities in every other sector. Kids at home not getting access to a laptop, parents at work, etc., much more exposed to all sorts of challenges. I think that in a policy context, and again, Sylvia mentioned this, we need to look transversally. We need to look at the cultural sector and the creative industries in the wider context, looking at education policy, looking at social policy, urban policy, and that the cultural and creative industries can only thrive when we get it right in those key areas of policy making, because otherwise it just becomes a victim of mistakes and gaps and absences in other parts of the policy system. So it does require not just a reframe in terms of cultural policy, it requires a reframe in every area of policy machine. And the cultural sector can't in any way work alone in that context. It needs big thinking from people who can move big things. And therefore, in these kinds of conversations, we need to find ways to bring in people who can make a difference in education policy and social policy, and obviously in economic policy as well. So I'm getting pessimistic again, but perhaps the optimistic opportunity is that we need to think big, holistically, transversally, and to steal Olu's language again, we need a climate change in the way that we position and understand culture in civil society.
Tom, I have nothing against talking about Finland for the rest of this panel, but and it's an easy way, easy punch to kind of say, what's all wrong after Brexit in UK and with the crisis. But from the public sector support, whether on the local level, on the regional or the national level, do you see anything? Have you seen anything in the past year that you could say is a sign in the right direction? Something that showcases maybe more deeper understanding how the sector works. It doesn't have to be from the government. It might be from a local or regional level as well.
Yeah, there are reasons to be cheerful. At a municipal level, and there's been quite a lot of direct action across Europe as well. And I suppose that municipalities are closer to the sector, and they tend to be more agile, obviously, than national policy. So we've seen, even in the UK, that there's the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, which has set out recovery funding, emergency funding. That's been distributed through organisations like Arts Council England, but at a municipality level, there have been emergency enterprise funding that's been distributed by central government. And the more enlightened municipalities, those that have also developed an evidence base in terms of the profile of the creative industries and the cultural sector, they've set out targeted funds to reach out to micro enterprises and freelancers in the creative industries, because they've recognised that there's a critical part of their economy. The difficulty is obviously that they're so straitened because of their finances are having to go towards social care, having to reach out to the more vulnerable in society in this crisis. So they haven't got much room to move. But I think it's been quite positive to see some local authorities actually recognising that they need to and have a responsibility to work with the cultural sector. There's also been quite a lot of interesting work in terms of bringing together new types of positive and cross-sector partnership around culture. This again we're seeing this in different parts of Europe. In the UK, there's been I think quite a lot of active partnership work where the partners in business support, in higher education institutions, in the cultural system and municipalities have got together, and health and wellbeing as well, sorry, have got together to work out some short-term and medium-term planning solutions for culture in place-based contexts. The city of Exeter is quite interesting though. They've been doing a lot of this, and it links to a wider agenda around livability and well-being. And that again is an opportunity for culture and the creative industries to recognise their role in this wider strategic approach towards well-being as a key fundamental principle for public policy in the future. So there are reasons to be cheerful or optimistic in some ways, but my concern is that as things open up, some of the gains made in reframing the value proposition and building new types of partnership, they may be lost in the kind of full throttle charge towards trying to restore some level of normality, but I hope not.
When the Brexit was looming, and it was before the crisis, the COVID crisis, there was this big discussion on whether this will lead for a significant disconnection in degrees of involvement of UK partners in cross-European projects. It might be slightly difficult to assess it now because everything is closed. But have you witnessed this yourself already? Do you see that you or your partners or a great UK partners have been less contacted, less involved, less engaged with pan-European initiatives? To
be honest, not yet. We've done quite a lot of research on this. We did some research recently with Manchester University looking at exploring the perceptions of UK cultural organisations in terms of their future relationships with European Union-based organisations, and also the sample of European Union-based organisations. It takes a while for the muscle to weaken in terms of the cultural relationships that have been built up over many years. And I think the real damage comes further down the track. Obviously, the exclusion of being able to participate in funding bids, which in turn build new relationships or concretise existing relationships, that's going to have a big impact. But that hasn't happened yet because we're still in those conversations. So some people obviously are still part of programs, funded programs. They got in just in time in some contexts. But it goes back to my point earlier on about it's the next generation. It's the people who have never been involved in cultural partnership projects with European Union organisations, and they never will now, or not in the same way because we're a third country. Everything now is about how we ensure divergence is as narrow as possible. So there are tactics that are in play there. So individual organisations such as mine and many other organisations across the culture sphere have set up offices inside the European Union so they can in different ways participate in European Union activities, technically as well as symbolically. There's a lot of municipalities that are free of the rhetoric of Brexit. The national government in the UK has played out, so they can build relationships such as through Eurocities. There are organisations like the British Council, which is also technically has an office, lots of offices across the European Union. They can still participate in European Union funded programs, and we're currently working with them on a European-wide artist mobility program and a museum exchange and innovation program, so they can create this third space perhaps. And Brexit, it obviously is a horror show in terms of the impact it can have in theory on the cultural sector. It's up to us in the UK, at least. It's not up to you guys, but it's up to us to make sure that we work as hard as possible to build bridges and gradually build back in cultural relationships that can be properly funded and ultimately can become new programs. But it all feels ludicrous because they were in this situation in the first place. But the danger is that if government still pushes for more and more divergence, it becomes structurally harder for the cultural sector to build close, intimate relationships with our colleagues across the European Union. But we can just do as much as we can to ensure that we stay as close as possible.
If you allow, let's shift our focus now more to the sector itself, because there's a lot of discussion on what the government and the public sector can do and what kind of measures to put in place. Tony already mentioned, but I think Europe has seen the evidence of kind of a consolidation and mobilization efforts by the sectors. So probably the sector is speaking with one voice more than maybe ever before. They are very clear in making calls for more support, demands, clarifying their positions. But what about the way that the creative sector themselves adapt to the new reality, and what is good or what is happening there, which could be which could be an exemplary to others, and what are the trends that we see which are not very promising? Silja, let's come to you, because just last week you organized yourself and you were part of another discussion which looked at the same kind of question in the framework of festivals, the future of festivals. So how do they themselves work out this new reality and adapt to the changes? Are they innovative enough? Your microphone yes.
Thank you. Yes, I think events and festival management in general is a really interesting sector in the sense that it is really at the core. I mean, it's an event with a lot of people, performing arts and so forth. And of course, they have been hit hard. And I don't want to belittle what is happening to them. And we will see what the end result is in a few years. But I do think when we looked into festivals, I mean, many of them have done incredible development of what they do, meaning how can they sell something, use online. Some of them have started utilizing almost TV-like studios, and we're starting to question things like what is the difference between streaming and a TV production and everything in between. And obviously, there's a lot of buzz about what are the other things that a festival can actually offer, because we know a festival, it's not just that 2 days you go to the concert. It's much more that people go for. It's not even just the socializing there too. It's sort of a lifestyle that you enjoy. It's that whole culture, the environment, what that sort of music represents to you. I've always used the example that, for instance, if you think of a jazz festival or a hard rock festival, you know the audience looks quite different, and you can just tell. They share something more than just the music. We know that. So it's a very interesting question in many degrees. And I think when we start thinking about festivals and all else that it is, there is a possibility to come up with a lot of other add-on digital services. What can it mean all year around? Does it include some musical workshops or lessons with your favorite musicians, or other things like this that make you feel like you belong to that entity? So it's very intriguing what all kinds of things they will come up with. And of course, I mean, I'll have to say in between, there's a lot of people, and according to this latest study, most people really are looking forward to returning to festivals. But I do believe that we will start seeing more and more hybrid entities of whatever festivals. I think the word hybrid came in here, that a lot of people start really finding the good points in distance working or distance education, or having meetings like with really short notice around the world. We didn't used to do that. It was technically possible, but we didn't used to do that. Now we do. So there's a lot of things that we have gotten used to that this really works online. And the same is true for the creative industries. the festivals might as best come up with some really cool things, how to integrate education, festivals, awareness raising, maybe other services, products, whatever, and we'll see. But in many cases, it does mean, I think, as far as skills go, it means, like came up in this discussion before too, it means working very cross-sectorally and very multidisciplinary for a good, great production and service concept with that actually offers many kinds of services. You really need different kinds of people with businesses, associations, whatever background form, and also from different disciplines. I mean, a festival itself includes, by the music, there's a huge, like all this just event technical management and stage management, to restaurants, to food, to hotels, accommodation, all the volunteer working and management, the cooperation with the city officials and so forth. So being able to, and I'm using festival sort of as a metaphor because it is a good metaphor. It really encompasses a lot of what is also in other sectors. So yes, as far as skills and things and possibilities, it is definitely diverse to different sectors, different disciplines, being able to lead network. When we talk about producing something in networks, again, if we think of a festival, there's a few people who work in a festival year round, but it moves hundreds of people annually. So you really need sort of network leadership. You might not have any formal leadership power or director's power, so to speak, but you need to influence the restaurants or the city people to, accommodate and think of how to manage the situation for the festival the best, because it actually benefits all. So there's a lot of skills that are involved in these sorts of, I could almost say, movements, if we talk about again, the creative industries looking wider than a specific enterprise or business. So those are some of the things that.
But Silja, yeah. But how much do you think will stick of what you were saying, and how much of this is a long-term change? If you look at the crisis, the timelines of the crisis and the reaction, then you could make, of course, in different sectors maybe differently, but more or less you can say that there was a phase of a shock where nothing happened and everything was cancelled, and then there was this first kind of a starting to with a bad quality and bad lighting and bad acoustics, streaming something on Facebook, and then kind of as you mentioned, getting to the point of a professional studios and TV productions. But kind of two elements, even in this kind of a professionalization and the kind of a hybrid modules of things, especially in countries where you could still have some part physical and some part had to be digital, but you still had two things which were difficult. One was lacking business models to support it in a long term. So kind of short term, keeping your audiences happy until we all can meet is a very different strategy from actually surviving over a year or a two or who knows how many years without a sustainable business plan that supports this. And the second one is with this hybrid model of there are so many examples of festivals, events, even individual productions to be actually able to attract tens, if not hundreds of times more views than they would have ever done in a real life, but they lack the opportunity to convert even part of this online visibility to a real life visit. Because the consumption patterns online are very different. Also, we have to add the problem of quality, especially those that are dealing with knowledge development, for example, trainings in the cultural educational programming in the cultural sector. Because if you do something for 5 hours and the average viewing time is 23 minutes, which is very good in digital terms, but if it's 23 minutes, then you would ask yourself, I mean, if it's real time, if I would be present 23 minutes of a 5-hour training, would I show up, or would I go and ask for a certificate, etc.? So how do you think those three elements of a business, lack of kind of a monetization models, a lack of conversion into from digital to real life visits, but also the lack of quality or concentration, impact what you were saying in long term, for example, for festivals?
I think those are really good questions, and like said, it's very easy to say, oh, just make it. It doesn't go that easy. And perhaps first of all, I do think now, like what the government can do is sort of realize that there's that sort of free time when nobody knows. None of us would have guessed a year ago or a little over a year ago that this would happen. And I think when we are trying to guess what will stick and what will not, we can't really know. We might even have a better idea than we had a year ago that there would be a pandemic, but not really. So I think it's very important to now also for the government to be open enough to fund trials, because people are sort of looking for what they're going to do anyway. So I hope that governments will have sort of the openness and courage to test things that might not work, because now, if ever, we are having to try those out. I think it's also, so obviously not everything is going to make, and I think the monetization thing is really a problem. I mean, it's a challenge for festivals as it is, and the digital world, like we know from the music business or AV production, content production in general, it's not easy and there's no one answer to it. I think it's another thing that needs to be developed all the time. And that's somewhere where I always have challenged economists to really work. It's not about knowing to run a business, it's how to develop the new business models and test them. And that's really like, I hope the economists would really focus more on that than I have seen them. Also, how to monetizing networks, because a lot of the time we're talking about networks doing one big production might call for 10 small businesses and a few other associations and a few free artists or whatever. So those are things that I really challenge from the business world to develop. There are no right answers. And another thing, when we were discussing with some of the festival people, I think I'd like to bring up here is that, yes, we can say as people who develop things, which is sort of easy then when you have to do it, that, oh, you should try new things, you should do this and that. But in the end, also, I think one thing that is really important now is the fact to remember that nobody knows. Like we're really in this together in the sense that we're all just guessing here. We can say that, oh, on a mega, it looks like this, after a crisis, this and this. But what it is a chance is on individual level for us to say that, hey, I don't know, what do you think? What do you think? And that's how the new solutions also come. And it's also about being open to saying, I don't know. I mean, yes, in the creative sector, you're a multidisciplinary work, especially, you're supposed to say, I don't know. But I hope that the sector really works with each other and goes beyond each other in the sense that to other sectors. I think obviously the digital and creative sector, this is really a time for them to cooperate. That's like very obvious. There's a million things. I think everybody knows it, but I still don't know it's so easy in practice. I hope the government really funds for different ways that artists and digital people meet on a people-to-people level. You know, a lot of times it's like they ended up married, the pair that did something really cool with arts and tech. So it's don't have to be like that, but I really also believe that it's not about organizations having networks. It's about people meeting and starting to discuss. And hey, so in one sense, I hope that the government's policies sort of is open enough to look at it and understand from many levels, from the grassroots levels. Let's help people, individuals, whether creatives or not, but obviously the creatives are in a really hot rut, to support this multidisciplinary action, and especially creatives and digital people and then to really understand the wide values of the creative industries in all other sectors like healthcare and inclusion, which is especially important also because of the pandemic. I hope I sort of answered your question.
Absolutely. And I think this also links to what you said before, that that we need more funding for experimentation, testing, trials, because of iterative process, kind of a lean startup thinking in the culture sector. And I think one thing that might support this attitude is also the fact that cultural funding mechanisms and culture funding bodies have been for ages criticized on fixating much attention to the indicators of quantity of, how the audiences, how many people saw it, and less about quality. So now when we don't really have any audiences at all, maybe now we can more look at different aspects and say, whether what we did in terms of projects help us to be ready, for the post crisis. But Tony, you, as I mentioned before, you are a creative person yourself. You are creative. You work with many other companies yourself as clients, and you see the bigger picture as well. Do you see that while the culture creative sector is very vocal about the government support for the crisis, that they are paying the same amount of attention to kind of innovating or adapting, maybe more, that's more right word, adapting to the new reality? I remember when the crisis started, maybe a month or two later, you were very angry, as much as you can be angry, about some practices. For example, you talked about some museums who, as one of the first steps to crisis, one of the first reaction to crisis, cut the entire education team.
That was
in times where maybe more education people should have been hired to create a link to all this, children that are now staying at home. So have you now seen in the last year, 8 months to a year, this shift to more future-oriented practices in the cultural organizations, or it's still very much about survival mode?
I think it really depends on a lot of things, and let's start from the leadership, and this goes from the leadership of arts organizations, leadership of arts councils, of ministries of culture. I think that has given us a clear indication on how leadership matters, and how good leadership versus bad leadership can leave a positive or negative impact. Just think a little bit about it. That there are articles there talking about female political leaders leading the way, where empathy stepped in as one of the most important things on how to deal with a crisis. Funnily enough, these happen to be countries with female prime ministers or female leader of cultural ministers, for example, responding in a way that was effective. So I think that is something we need to look at. The second thing is, and this is something which from a local context, but probably even it resonates with what everyone is saying, cultural policymaking tended for quite a long time to kind of fragment the subsidized versus the for-profit, where we think of sustainability as if it's some kind of or financial or profitability as if this kind of dirty word. If you make profit, then you're not in the world of receiving possible public support. So the narrative has been quite for a very long time dominated by this kind of the traditional concept of what we understand by the cultural sectors, for example. If you're subsidized and supported, and probably in a time of crisis, that was the first group that was being looked at to be saved or supported. Suddenly, we had an industry, be the entertainment industry, the film industry, whatever, that was doing pretty well, that was developing with or without state support, with very few measures there. Suddenly, also having this conversation. So both ended up even kind of struggling for that little kitty. And there were moments when these two realized, in our case, for example, hey, we actually never spoke to each other. We're a dance company and never spoke to a games company. So in a way, I think that was something that helped some companies, even individual artists, to rethink their positioning. So suddenly they said, hey, maybe I should have a conversation with a games company, because now it's the way. And actually, it's not because I want to survive, but suddenly I've realized that there's a whole new world out there which I've never explored. The same thing from that online, that digital engagement. So people are realizing that suddenly if I create a piece of work which previously toured schools, now I can create a piece of work which actually can be sold to schools at the same time, viewed by many more people. Probably hitting from a cultural policy perspective, the increase in engagement box, increasing audiences box. So I think if we start shifting our mindset and opening up a little bit, I think there are some, I may be an eternal optimist here, but I think there are ways, because even when we spoke about digitalization, we've been talking about digitalization for years. We've been saying, and probably museums were better than everyone else to actually start understanding why digital is so important. Also, preservation, first and foremost, but also suddenly realizing that there is a world out there on how we engage more people in bringing people through our virtual doors, as much as libraries were able to open up much more because they were prepared to do this. Those who were not thinking and acting digitally suffered because, and again, this does not change the experience of actually going to a library to find the book. But we've known this for decades, that no, people do not go to a library just to get a book. They go to a library because of the experience of going to a library, as much as going to the experience to sit down at a cinema. During our own restrictions, I went to the cinema, and it was, and I hadn't been there for a year. And it was magical more than any, and where actually I said, I can't believe, not just because I'm sitting in a cinema, but actually it is true. Sitting in a cinema watching a movie is a completely different experience to sitting at home watching a great film on Netflix. And I think even ourselves, we tend to be very critical, but watching a movie, watching a theater show online is less than watching it in person in a theater. It is different. And I think this started to emerge when we started seeing, operas being screened in cinemas across the world. But that experience has to be great. It was fascinating. The moment when the pandemic hit, everyone started putting their material online. Most of it was really bad. Shot in a bad way, the sound was horrible. Probably it's going to scare away audiences more than bring them in. So again, this is the kind of infrastructure you need. So probably theaters who are now seeing that their audiences have actually increased because they've aired their opera or their play or their whatever, now embedding that in your infrastructure, in your governance, in your funding process is part and parcel of what you should be doing. Probably what this year has shown us, we've kind of escalated all this in, what could have probably taken us another 10 years it's the same thing. No one usually takes 10 years to create a vaccine. We did it in a year. And the same process, if it usually takes us 10 years to see a policy develop, it's taking us a year to do this, which is pretty positive. But I think this is an important process for us to understand what needs to stay and what we should be okay to let go. For it, we know that human interaction will be there to stay. Let's not fight it. We've been doing this in the arts from the Greeks even before that. We always found a way, even during war, after war, for people to come together. So, I've had these conversations, people, organizing festivals saying, after all this, it's not worth even going back to live. Well, why not? I mean, if there is a business possibility for you not to, explore that. If there's a creative way on how to do that, yes, why not? I find no reason why I should attend any conference anytime in the near future just for me to sit down and listen. I won't travel to do that. Why? Because sitting from my home without getting on a plane to listen to someone has been it worked fine. Here we are today. Probably this context a year ago, well, 2 years ago, would have meant the four of us getting a plane, going somewhere to sit down and have a chat for 40 minutes, have a great lunch, have some wine or beer, then get the flight back. The added value of that would have been, yeah, maybe hugging all of you. Of course, I would have loved that. Getting some good food. Yeah, why not? But, probably I'm even more engaged right now than actually sitting inside a theater, dim lights, after lunch, sitting, maybe nodding a bit. So I think we should not underestimate. And at times I feel that this is the same conversation when people say, culture is a tool, or and the struggle between culture as a tool or or actually struggling with arts for art's sake. We need to coexist with all this. And I'm not up for a conversation of, is it digital? Is it physical? Is it physical now? Because we've merged the two as well. But we need to learn how to maximize these. I've realized the deficiencies I have as a producer, as a creative person, on how to engage in the digital world. I don't have the skills, and probably this deficiency, I will only be able to address this if I get my own training, but actually I have to engage people to do this. 10 years ago, we were talking about training people in the arts to be entrepreneurs. Now we're done with that. Now we need to make sure that they are artists, entrepreneurs, but digital natives at the same time.
Fantastic to hear, to listen to all of you. I'm looking at the time and I have two quick questions. And if our listeners think that it is possible to script a panel like this with people like you, they are very much mistaken. So these two questions, quick questions, short questions to all of you will be surprise to you. But you will come out of it. So let's start with Tom. If you would be, for one day, a powerful minister of culture, or a secretary of sports, media, and culture department, and you would have a chance to put in place one measure that is impactful, that is necessary, and that takes into account all the criticism that you've shared so far of the existing measures, what would you do?
Well, just one day, Ragnar. Okay.
One day.
I think all of this bears down to who's not in the room. I hate to say it to you all, guys, we are not the future. And this is what a minister needs to realize. So I would look at the investment portfolio for culture, and I would then look at what isn't on that investment portfolio. I would try to seed the future. So I would set up a funding and investment and development program for the new, for the next, for cultural participation, engagement, development, and the production of new culture, which is youth orientated, and it's about diversity, and it's about sustainability. That's what I would do. Simple as that. Yes, there's the ongoing challenge about how you keep funding and how you renovate and repair the sector that you have. And by the way, that is going to involve quite a lot of casualties, but invest in those who aren't in your echo chamber, invest in the next.
It's interesting that you pointed out that particular focus, because years ago, the initiative that your government launched, creative partnerships, really, went throughout the world, throughout Europe, and was such an inspirational initiative for many, many countries before it was scrapped. It's here to see that focus back, at least from your view. Silja, as a Minister of Culture. Microphone.
Yes, so I would probably go, as I called for courage, I would probably go for putting out a fund with a very simple way to apply for the funding, which would pretty much mean like about a few pages, just okay, like background, so I understand why, and then something that you can do to better the world or the society. That's it. And if it's for creatives, fine, but as we're speaking of that, but in any field. So if it's a creative who decides that I actually had better off just painting houses or whatever, fine. And then there would be a few categories of, 10,000, 100,000 or something in between. And that's it. 2 days to go through and just take the chance.
Painting your house, 100,000, 1 page. I think that sounds fantastic. Thank you, Silja. Toddy.
For a day,
you almost been a minister, or close to being a minister, or deputy, or whatever. So
never ever. I think for a day I wouldn't want to be Minister of Culture, but it would be important for me to be Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Because I firmly believe that a Minister of Culture on his or her own can't do what we want to do. Because if we're talking about well-being, inclusion, issues of sustainability and climate change, these tend to be transversal, and you need a Prime Minister to actually be able to sit down with a cabinet meeting, and the cabinet actually that gives direction for all ministries to understand and to integrate culture across board. Why? Because the growth from economic point of view, from a social, from even an environmental point of view, that is where changes, that is where the role of culture needs to be strengthened. And also where culture can even contribute much more. That's what I will do.
Yeah, I didn't expect any other answer from you, Tony, anyway. Culture Minister is just too small for you. So the last very quick question, and probably knowing me, you all can guess what that question is. So you probably have had 90 minutes to prepare. So if we meet in this fantastic group in a year's time, what the world will look like? Very shortly. Tony, let's start with you.
Can I use the same answer? Because I've been talking about how important it is for us to do things digitally, but I reiterate that there is nothing more valuable than being in the same room with people for a meaningful conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So I want the world to have, in a year's time, meaningful conversations based on what we've learned. Just a small thing which I haven't mentioned, which I wanted to mention. It's for me, this year has been not just emotional, but also a way on how I can connect with other people from outside Europe. And I've spent time, with clients, with friends, with colleagues who are actually telling me this crisis compared to other crises they've lived through is absolutely nothing. We should learn from arts organizations who survived war, conflicts, genocide. I'm not saying that, but and it's not just about resilience and about inspiration, but actually talking about constantly changing your models. How do you operate in a country where you're forced to close down your borders? How do you operate in a country which is international and visas are never given to you? How do you operate in a country where your theater has been bombed? So I think we need to eat some humble pie as well, and actually figure out that this experience needs to change us. And if it's not going to change us, then we've really wasted our time.
And by the way, this argument has been quite a lot used also in a country like in Estonia, for example, which has seen, rapid development in the last 20, 30 years, but still people even, I was born still in times of occupation, and we've seen times where there was no money, no infrastructure, no nothing, and you had to get along with very little. And then still people say, those numbers that we see now is nothing compared to what we have went through in 90s or the crisis in 2000. So I think that is a relevant point to put things in perspective and give you this a bit of humble sense. Celia, where would we be in 1 year time?
I think, and I hope, of course, that as we have talked, that the creative industries hopefully is seen wider. So I hope the change that we see is qualitative by nature. We know the numbers that the economy looks like and so forth, but then if we think on individual level, there are people who go really challenging time and have lost their business or job or whatever. And my heart really is out for those. And I do hope that a big number of those also will find something meaningful. And a bigger part will be those that actually came out in the end in that good. And I hope it is also time for us to sort of appreciate the sort of reflective side of culture that now when we are inside our houses and social distancing, I know there are people who really dislike and are yearning for the social connections, but I also know there's a lot of people who actually have finally been able to cut off the everyday stress and mess around them and have really sort of balanced their personal lives. So I hope we get that sort of balance to balance those tragic and really I do not want to by any means put down the challenging times for many. And I do think also in that it depends very from individual to individual. So it looks different depending who you are talking to, and we shouldn't forget that.
Thank you, Celia. They say, Tom, that a pessimist is just a well-informed optimist. So last year you were very well informed. What about now? Where are we in 1 year time?
Okay, well, I've been using a quote a lot over the last year from the mayor of Milan, Giuseppe Sala, who says that we need to rethink the rhythms of the city. And I like that for a while, but I've actually come to reconsider it and feel that's a bit too responsive. And what I think will happen in a year's time, I'm pretty sure we're going to be out there much more, and we're going to be meeting each other, but equally importantly, if not more importantly, we're going to be meeting new people. And that's what the digital hasn't yet found a way to effectively facilitate, meeting new people. And that's where the beer with the new person is really important, knowing about their lives, etc. But what I think this is going to generate is a new era of absolute cultural activism. It's going to necessitate a new era of cultural activism because there's a storm coming. We're all in a phony reality now, as I said. The economic fracturing, the rise of nationalism, the health inequalities, the environmental pressures means there's a storm coming. So the cultural sector is at its most vital in times of crisis when it can do something about it. And we're going to be out there meeting physically as well as more able to deal with digital tools. And the cultural sector will have a responsibility to be a vital activist in renewing hope, restoring trust, and solidifying a notion of civil society when so much is fracturing. And that means that we'll be at the heart of the conversation, but the challenge is about having the power and the influence to make the world a better place. the cultural sector as it is, final word, isn't ready to have that inspired activist role by itself. We need new blood. We need to open up the conversation, and we need to work with other sectors to do that. So I'm optimistic, but the bigger picture is we have to be active in a context of significant social and economic and environmental unrest and challenge.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I don't know what's going to happen in a year. I know one good news, that spring is coming, and that only means one thing, that summer is coming. So these are the good news, especially here in the Northern Hemisphere, close to the Santa Claus, where Santa Claus is living. Really enjoy talking to you as always. Your great insights and takes on where the world is in terms of culture, creativity, and the crisis impacts, and how to get out of this mess. Tonia Tartt, Silja Suntala, and Tom Fleming. I'm Ragnar Seal. Thank you also for all our viewers today, and big thanks to Institute Novum and also the European Liberal Forum that supported today's talks. Until next time, see you soon.
Thank you.
Yeah.